Okay. Yep. Beginning already. I can start, I suppose. Yeah. Also recording has started. I think so. Yes. I see a light.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is recorded, right? It is
Yeah,
recorded.
yeah.
Good. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to see nice public here and online. Let me start by, so my name is Norberto Pignatti. I am Associate Professor of Policy at the International School of Economics at Tbilisi State University. I've been also for several years heading the Center on Energy and Natural Resources Management of ISET Policy Institute in Georgia. And in that capacity, we have been cooperating with the Georgian government to analyze energy policies, among other things. Anyway, so first of all, let me by thanking STREACS for inviting me for organizing this seminar, actually series of seminars. This is the second one I am giving, and there will be another one on the 15th of April. So the members of STREACS is a program that has been funded by the EU, and it includes several partners. The Acopian Center for the Environment here at the AUA, the National Polytechnic University of Armenia, the Scientific Research Institute of Energy of Armenia, the Maynooth University in Ireland, the University of Genoa from Italy, University of Campana, Luigi Vanvitelli from Italy, and Artemat SR from Italy as well. And the idea of STREACS is to strengthen the energy transition research in Armenia and disseminate information and increase the research capacity in this area, which is again key, given the importance of energy transition for all countries, and of course also for Armenia as well. Now, in the previous seminar, actually, we were speaking about how important this could be in terms of in the face and thinking at energy security issues, right? Anyway, so the topic of this seminar is, now I will be standing and walking a bit, but is conducting cost-benefit analysis for energy policies. And so my intention, okay, do I have to turn it on?
Maybe keep him on the screen. Where is the screen?
Not even there. So I will just do like this, or like this, no, or like this.
Just clicking should work.
Yeah, clicking with the mouse works. So I will do this. So basically, I am going to go through to give a kind of very quick overview of, first of all, what CBA purpose is in general, and then I will be focusing on the key aspects, right? The key features of CBA that make it interesting when assessing energy policies. But then I will focus on the key aspects that pertain to energy policies. Okay, CBA is used in many ways and in many contexts. So applying it to energy policies is particularly challenging. We will see why, and it requires a very different approach from the CBA that is applied, for example, to a very specific project. Okay, and so I will conclude by mentioning what are the limitations of CBA when it is not possible to have it, and what alternative or complementary approaches one can adopt when assessing energy policies. Now, let's start from this premise. We need a tool like cost-benefit analysis because societies are faced with a key economic problem, which is there are limited resources available for economic activities to satisfy a potentially unlimited set of needs. If we think, right, about the way in which we can use the resources that are available, there is an unlimited combination of ways in which we can use the resources. However, once we use a resource for one specific purpose, we lose it, de facto, right? Maybe at some point we can recycle it, but again, the efficiency will not be 100%. So some resources will be lost. If we commit them to one particular project or activity, then we will not be able to reap the benefits from alternatives. And this is what we, as economists, define as the opportunity cost, right? The loss of the opportunity to use the resources in some other way. And so if societies want to prosper, given the limited resources available, including environmental, the state of the environment, so we want to find the most productive way of using such resources. CBA is a tool built exactly for that, to help us understand what is the best possible use of the resources, and whether or not starting a given project or implementing a certain policy is going to increase or decrease the well-being of society. What is cost-benefit analysis doing? Well, again, what is it? It is a process that allows us to identify, measure, and compare the incremental costs and benefit of a project or of a change in a public policy. Why do we stress the word incremental? Because basically we are looking at definitely always at least at the status quo, which is the situation in which we are, and we want to see if we add on top of the situation in which we are living, if we add a new project or a new economic policy, how will this change the future path of the economy? Will it generate more benefits than the cost associated with using some resources to implement that policy or not? Basically, to implement a project or a policy, we need to consume some of the resources. And so what we want to know is if what we obtain as a result will be a net increase in the well-being of society or a net decrease, okay? And so in broader sense, the purpose of the CBA is to facilitate a more efficient allocation of the scarce resources that the society has. Pay attention to this, efficient allocation, because this is a very particular and specific way of assessing whether or not a policy or project are beneficial. It's one particular dimension, but there are many dimensions. For example, let me just mention a few. One could worry about or be concerned about equity in addition to efficiency. One could focus on some particular outcome, like what is going to happen to employment. Is it going to go up or down? What is going to happen to the environment, to biodiversity, right? To the health of people. What cost-benefit analysis does, and we will see it, is trying to give us an idea of whether, from the economic point of view, this situation, this new project or this new policy is leading to an improvement. It might mean that it might happen that even though we have an improvement in efficiency from the economic point of view, we have a deterioration in terms of environmental quality, or we might have an increase in inequality, or we might have a reduction in employment, and still, as at the country level, we might have an improvement from an economic point of view. So we have to be aware of the fact that this is a very specific dimension. But typically, because cost-benefit analysis tries to give a monetary value to almost all aspects we can think of, it is a very useful tool. It is simpler to visualize whether there is an improvement or a loss, right? And so it is one of the key instruments that we use. Now, how does cost-benefit analysis work? We said cost and benefit. How do we assess the benefits? Well, the idea of the benefit is if somebody in a society is willing to pay something for what comes out of this project, of this policy, then, or for the policy change in general, then it means these people are benefiting, right? And we can measure their willingness to pay. And that will be ideally the measure of the benefits from the policy. Then we have costs, the opportunity cost, we said. So basically, what are we giving up to achieve those benefits? And when we compare them, we subtract from the benefits the costs, then we obtain the net benefits. A policy is improving the well-being of the society if the net benefits are greater than 0. But why do we care about these net benefits? And what is the idea, the rationale behind this approach? It comes from welfare economics, the economics that studies the welfare of countries and of individuals. And this welfare economics has a very important principle, which is called the Kaldor-X rule, which says a program or a policy has a positive net benefit if those who gain from the change gain enough to compensate those who lose. And think about it. De facto, anytime there is a policy change, it's very hard to be in a situation in which everybody is gaining or benefiting. If you increase the strictness of environmental regulation, a lot of people will be benefiting, but probably the workers and the owners of the companies that are more polluting will lose. They will lose profits. Some people will lose jobs. The society overall might be better off, but some groups of people will be losing. Same thing is when you liberalize trade. There is a consensus among economists that typically being able to trade increases everybody's opportunity. And overall societies tend to gain. But if you have a closed economy and you open it up, then cheaper goods can be coming in, maybe even higher quality goods. And the consumers are benefiting, but those who were producing the goods before are now facing a bigger competition. Again, some companies might close and some workers might lose jobs. It's almost impossible to find a situation in which there is a change and everybody is gaining. So if we were to accept only the changes that make everybody better off, then we would probably not want any change. Okay? And that's why we have this principle. This principle says, as long as those who gain enough to be able to compensate those who lose, then the society is gaining and the losers potentially can be compensated. So they don't lose potentially. And this is the key. So this is a theoretical construct. In practice, it's not always so easy to compensate the losers. But one hopes that if the economy is improving, eventually it will happen. Or it could be one way to try to get closer to that would be that the government explicitly acknowledges who is losing and tries to put in place some mechanisms to compensate them, right? Now, this means also that efficiency is very tricky from this point of view. And we can do this type of balancing, right? Those who lose compensate those who win. If it happens for real in monetary terms, then it's easy. But if it is only potential, then it means we are giving the same weight to the gains of those who gain and to the losses, because there is not a real compensation. We're just subtracting one from the other, which might be problematic, not in efficiency terms. In efficiency terms, it works. But from other point of view, for example, in equity, let's say that there is a policy that increases the well-being of a country and we monetize it in $1 billion. But then we see that in reality, this $1 billion goes, I'm making it very extreme to make the point, to one person. And everybody else in the country is losing $500 million. For the country overall, from the efficiency point of view, it's a gain. Would the country subscribe to it? It's not clear, right? From the equity point of view, it's very questionable that only one person gains so that everybody else loses, or better, everybody has to lose so that one person gains 1 billion, right? So it's important to understand how efficiency works. Now, we can extend this idea to the case in which you compare alternative options. If you have multiple policy alternatives, clearly from an efficiency point of view, you want to choose the one with the highest net benefits. I think also this ceteris paribus, of course. Then if you have other criteria, you might compare them also with the other criteria. But the idea of CBA is, of course, choose always the alternative that gives the highest net benefits. Now, let me do a short digression about the difference between financial and economic perspective, because often I have been seeing cost-benefit analysis done that tend to collapse into a financial analysis, which means you have revenues, you have costs, observed because you buy inputs and then you give a price to some outputs and then you say, okay, it's winning or losing money, this project, you discount, you use exactly the same tools, but you stop there. So you look at what are the costs and the revenues that you get. This is a financial analysis. It is not a cost-benefit analysis, because there are many other aspects that if you care about efficiency, you should include in your calculation. In a standard cost-benefit analysis done with a narrow financial perspective, you do not look, for example, at whether the prices that you are using, because they are the ones you're paying in the market, are these efficient prices or are they distorted prices? Sometimes markets don't work properly. If they don't work properly, the prices don't tell you the real cost and the real benefits. And so you have to correct those if you want to do a cost-benefit analysis. For the financial analysis, it's fine. Private investors care about the money they pocket and the money they pay. They do not really care about whether or not that price is correct. But a government that is trying to take a decision that is increasing the well-being of the society must care about this. And must care also about other costs and benefits for which there is no market. There is not a market for clean air or clean water. This does not mean that they don't have a value for human beings and for the society. If you have bad quality of air and water, there are high health costs. And these are costs both for individuals and for the society, which then has to pay bigger expenses for healthcare, loses the capacity of these people even to work. So it's not only a loss for the person, it's the loss for the society, right? So all these things are not captured in markets. And that's something that the analyst has to try and quantify. And there is a big literature in cost benefit about how to look at that. So it can happen that there are some very straightforward cases in which you do a financial analysis and the economic analysis, and they give you the same results. No, it's a loss for a private company. It's also a loss for society. Or it's a gain for the private company and it's a gain for society. These cases are trivial. You don't need to do cost-benefit analysis if you know this in advance. However, you have more trickier questions when they are giving different results. What happens if, for example, we have a positive financial analysis and a negative economic analysis? Okay, that means that although a private company would start that project or implement that policy, for the society, it's damaging to do so. So if the government, for example, has to authorize some particular project, in this case, it might want to rethink about it or to renegotiate with the private investor so that they somehow, for example, if the cost to society is due to the fact that there is a lot of negative environmental or big environmental damage, maybe there are some measures that the company could put in place that don't cost too much, that would limit most of the damages, and then they would make this also economically beneficial, and then it could be approved. From a cost-benefit analysis, you could learn the opposite, that some project that no company would start, in reality is very beneficial for society. And in that case, the government could think about how incentivize the company to start a very beneficial project, maybe with a subsidy, maybe with a partnership. There are many tools that could be used, right? But if this is the importance of cost-benefit analysis, which has an economic point of view and which is not necessarily captured by financial analysis. So I will go, again, one can speak hours about this. So I will go very quickly through this just to give you a picture of how cost-benefit analysis, is structured. Because there are a few points that then I will be discussing in greater detail because it is in our interest, right? When we want to see what are the specificities of CBAs of energy policies. Now, typically you start by understanding what the problem is that you have to assess. There is a discussion with a lot of stakeholders, and then you identify the main options you can choose from. Decide which costs and which benefits matter. For example, if you have an investment from on a particular, for example, on a power plant built in Armenia, and this investment comes from abroad, let's say it's a thermal power plant, so it emits, it has pollution because it emits, it uses carbon fossil fuel, so it generates negative emissions. The thing is very profitable. It's very different if who is investing is an internal investor or an international investor. Typically, when you do cost benefit, you care about people of the country. If their profits go all out of the country, for example, they don't count as a benefit for the project. Okay, so you have to decide whose costs and benefits count. If I make a very trivial or even strange example, if the costs go all outside the country, CBA would not care about it. Like if all the pollution went outside, then for the analyst who has to do it for Armenia would say, well, in Armenia there is no negative impact. Okay, so that's why it's important to decide ahead which costs and benefits for whom they are and which one counts. But the core we are going to discuss a bit more in detail today is this center, right? The core of cost-benefit analysis. After we have decided which individuals, which groups, which area we care about, we need to first identify and catalog all the impacts that are generated by the policy. Then we predict them over time because the impacts are not usually once. When you do a project or implement a policy, this typically has an effect for many years. And so you have to predict all the impacts for all the duration of your analysis. And after you have quantified them, you monetize them. So you have to attribute a value to these impacts, which is not always easy. After that, however, even though they are in monetary terms, all these costs and benefits are in different periods of time. So how do you compare 100 drams today to 100 drams in 300 years? They don't have the same value, clearly, right? So you have to reconduct everything to today. And that's where you discount, you bring them back. And now you can add up all the costs, all the benefits, which are all calculated as cost and benefits today, and you obtain the net present value. And from this, you can already see, is there an improvement or a loss for the country? And basically, if NPV or net present value is positive, then it means that overall, the discounted benefits are greater than the discounted costs. So basically, the benefits are larger than the opportunity cost of the resources we're using. Then, again, I will not spend time mentioning even the other 2 points. So the key of CBA is in reality, and that's what makes it so useful, is the monetization. Because not only you identify all the impacts, but you can give a monetary value to all of them. That means that even though the impacts might be very different, because you might have environmental, health, you might have simply, I consume a product, I produce a product, right? Generate some monetary revenues. All of these things that are very different from each other are all converted in monetary value. So you can add them up and then subtract the costs. And these are, now I'm going slightly more in depth, not too much, because again, one could spend a lot of time in this. When you catalog the impact, what do we mean by impact? So we have a broader definition, which is anything like all the costs of the inputs for our project or for our policy, and the value of the outputs. So what are the outputs? What is happening? How is the environment affected? How many salaries are paid to the people involved? How much is paid for the resources we buy? How much is received from selling the products we generate? Okay, these are all the inputs. We do at this stage we quantify them, right? We identify them first, then we quantify them, and then we monetize them. Now, the main thing about to be considered an impact in a narrow term, we are just looking what comes out of the policy. And so to be classified as an impact, it must be something that comes out of the policy. It can be a product that is produced. It can be a change in the endowment of resources. It can change in environmental quality, all of these things. But you have to classify that as an impact. There must be satisfied 2 conditions. One, there must be a cause and effect relationship between our actions and the outcome. And then we need another connection. That outcome must affect the utility of somebody, some human being that has standing, as we said before. So as a paradox, if we change something, if we even, let's say, end up destroying something unique, but no human cares about it, and no human is willing to pay anything for it, then for cost-benefit analysis, we have no loss. So this is, again, very restrictive way of thinking. But this is necessary, right? Because the main point of cost-benefit analysis is to compare costs and benefits in monetary terms. If nobody is willing to pay anything for a resource, for some product, even for living creatures, if nobody's willing to pay anything to protect them, then for cost-benefit analysis, that value is 0. So this is a very particular approach that one has to be aware. All of this said, after the monetization, we have everything, as we said, and we get to that. Now, the hardest thing to do when one does cost-benefit analysis is typically to get the right prices, because the markets are not always right. They might be distorted by taxes. They might be distorted because the price does not take into account the fact that to produce a certain good, you actually damage natural resources, damage the environment, damage human health, and so on. Or you create positive effects. Also that, if a particular project leads to an improvement, right, in the living condition of the population, but there is no extra price paid for it, right, then the benefit is not captured by the price. If we could, we would give more money to this person. For example, let's say that somebody decides to install solar panels, and there are at that moment no policies of incentives, nothing. This person will decide only based on its own gains. If I can gain by installing a solar panel because I save cost of electricity, I will do it. This person will not do it because the quality of air will improve if we burn less fossil fuels. But if somehow the price of the electricity that this person sells, right, the one that it does not capture, was increased to reflect that, the person would find it more profitable, more people would find it profitable to have solar panels, and they would improve the quality of air. But the fact that there is not, maybe you are paid just the value, market price of electricity if you sell it, will make you have less solar panels that you would have as a country than you would have otherwise. So you understand the difference between prices, right? This is one of the challenges. Now, there is another problem. So when you try to quantify these impacts for a project that is small size, you can go into the market, maybe adjust the prices relatively easily to take into account these spillover effects. And that's it. Once you have calculated the costs from buying the inputs, you have given a value to the outputs, you are done. What happens when you do something bigger, like, for example, an energy policy? The energy policy has much larger impacts, right? It's very different to build a wind turbine, install it, or to change the energy policy in a country, for example, introducing a tax on carbon. Because the turbine, okay, you buy it, you install it, you pay the salaries to people who install it, you manage, you do maintenance, and so on. You sell electricity, but one turbine is not changing the price of electricity. Buying one turbine is not changing the market for turbines or for the resources needed to build it. If you put a carbon tax, this will affect the entire economy. People will start changing their behavior. They will all face different costs. The energy price will change. This will be reflected in all the goods that are produced. It will be reflected in the energy mix of the country, in imports, in exports, everywhere. So the impacts, of course, are much broader. You cannot just take the costs you have, a specific cost of paying somebody to put in place the new policy. How do you capture that? You need a very different approach. So while when we look at doing the cost-benefit analysis of projects, we adopt what the economists say is a partial equilibrium approach, which means we just look at what is happening, at what is touched directly by the project, the inputs, the outputs. But we assume that the rest of the world is not really affected in a major way. When we look at the policy, we cannot assume that. We know that prices will change across the country in all sectors. So this will have effects on employment. This will have effects on energy choices. It will have effect in production and consumption choices, in import, in export, and so on. And we need what is called a general equilibrium approach. So we cannot assume that everything else remains the same. We will have to find a way to model all the changes that happen because of that. Because only in that way we can measure the overall impact of the policy change and see whether it has increased or decreased the well-being of the society. This is, again, the idea of general equilibrium approach. You have now not only to look at the specific budget of a project, now you have to look at the structure entire of the economy. You have to represent all the sectors, including the energy sector. And then you have to, in this model, you introduce a shock. You go inside the energy sector and you change the energy sector to take into account what the policy change has been, what the energy policy change has been. And then you run the simulation, basically, and you see how the economy is changing. First, you run it, I don't know, let's say you are interested over a 10-year horizon. You look over 10 years, and you say, how is it, what is happening in 10 years if I don't do anything? So with the economy as it is now, with the energy sector as it is. You do it, you run it, and then you plug in the shock, the policy change in the energy sector, and then you rerun the simulation. Then you will have different paths. You will have different evolution of all the economic sectors. You will have different imports, different exports. You will have different energy mix, and so on. And then you compare the second picture with the first picture, and you see the changes. And there is where you can extract the information to do your assessment. Has the well-being of society increased or not? Okay, I'm keeping it in this type of framework. So I'm giving you the intuition because, of course, I mean, if I were to show you, for example, even just one model like that, it would take way longer than the time that we have here. These are entire courses at a very high level. So, but it is very important to understand the idea, right? So, but ultimately, even if we use this, we are doing the same we were doing in the analysis of a project. We try to have a monetization of the benefits and of the costs, right? We will have a value for GDP before and a value for GDP after. We will have a value for household consumption before and a value for household consumption after. I mention household consumption because typically, when you do this type of analysis, all comes up to the population of the country. Can they consume more or have more goods and services or less? That is basically the main measure of welfare change. Okay, that's why I mentioned consumption. But you can have a lot of information. Which sector is going to expand? By how much? Which sector is going to shrink? So you can get information about employment changes and in import, export. So not always you use this modeling of general equilibrium to get a specific nationwide change in well-being. Sometimes you use this to complement the partial equilibrium analysis of a project or a policy. So you have an analysis that looks more financial, but then you get additional information. You test. Is it appropriate to focus only on this particular intervention? Or if I do a general equilibrium analysis, the results are totally different. Because in that case, I should move to general equilibrium analysis. So what are the expected impacts? The main one from make a policy change in the energy sector. There will be definitely price changes because energy is a key input throughout the entire economy. If you make a policy change, you will affect the cost of energy. If you affect the cost of energy, you will affect the prices across the economy because all the products and services include energy. So if the price of energy goes down, typically it will help reduce prices across the economy. But if you use the most costly energy mix, then the prices will tend to go up. Quantity changes. As price change, people will demand more or less of certain goods and services. Of course, the changes will be bigger in sectors where the energy price is more relevant. Okay, these type of models do allow for changes in demand. So to understand what the consumers will do if you change the price of energy, which will change the price of the product they buy, will they buy more, will they buy less, in all the sectors. They do it all simultaneously, this type of model. Then it can tell you change in GDP, in household consumption, changes in external effect. Will pollution go up? Will pollution go down? Quality of air, quality of water. We can derive that from this model because we can see, for example, how much gas, how much oil is going to be used as an effect of the policy change in the energy sector. Maybe if you go towards a green transition, you will reduce, right? Ideally, the use of fossil fuels. That will reduce emissions. So you can measure, you can predict the reduction in the use of fossil fuels. And given that then there are technical, relationship between how much oil and gas you burn and how much you emit, you will be able to calculate the change in emissions, for example. And then you can also, but this is not entering the cost-benefit analysis. You can also, if you model it, because it's not automatically given, you can understand how this policy is going to affect different groups in society. For example, the poorest, the richest, the most vulnerable. This is possible only if you build the model to represent that. Otherwise, you must want to see this. Otherwise, by default, it doesn't show it. You can estimate the employment level because you see the changes by sector. If they expand, if they shrink, if the technologies change and they need more workers or less workers, and so on. So you will have to, also this you have to model. And you can also check the changes in energy security, potentially, right? So all of these are not related necessarily to efficiency, but they can come out from the same models. And you can use them later if you decide so. And so if you're interested, there are two main ways to approach this modeling. I'm speaking just broadly of the two big categories that I think are the most representative. The top-down models, which are models that do what I just said. They model the economy as a whole, and inside the economy, there is the energy sector. Okay? These models are very useful. They have a drawback. They are top-down, so they are type of macro models, and the energy sector is not modeled in extremely high level of detail. Okay? So you can see broad effects, but you cannot go very much into detail about what is happening inside. What can be a solution to that, an improvement? Well, there are models instead that are built only to model the energy sector. They're very good at minimizing, for example, the costs at the economy level of satisfy the energy need of a country. You can combine them, and this is when you get the hybrid model. So basically, you combine these two types of models, and what you do is you take the policy change in energy and plug that into the energy part, which is very detailed now because it is this model. And this will find the cost minimizing, the old and the new cost minimizing combination, right, of energy sources, energy generation, production, so on. You take that output and you actually connect it to it will be an input for the top-down model. And you will see how the prices in all sectors will change, how demand will respond, how supply will respond. That will give a feedback to the energy sector, because if demand changes in reality, then the demand for energy also changes. And you have an iterative process until you get convergence, hopefully, and then you will find an equilibrium point in which you will know how, after all the adjustments, we are now having a new equilibrium with certain level of production, certain level of energy consumption, certain energy mix, and so on. And there you can assess what the effects have been in terms of well-being and in terms of all these other factors that we were interested in. And again, we did it actually for Georgia in 2 occasions. And we were able indeed to look at changes in prices, quantities, GDP, remuneration of factors of production, household consumption, external effects, and so on and so forth. So it was very instructive, very interesting, very challenging. It took several months just to build the models. That's why typically it's not done. So typically, cost-benefit analysis is done in a partial equilibrium setup because it's much easier. However, when we look at energy policies, because of the big impact they can have, doing this exposes you to the risk of missing very important feedback effects. You can still do it, of course, if you had no other choice, because it's very costly and time-consuming to build models of the economy and of the energy sector. Okay, and even to combine them, even if they exist. Because, for example, first we built the computable general equilibrium model at the ISET Policy Institute, which was this first type, the top-down. It had an energy sector, but was relatively simple. And then we combine our model with another that was developed by the government of Georgia to model the energy sector. And then it took some time to combine them, to make them work together. And then we used it to do some other cost-benefit analysis of potential policy changes they had in mind. How much time do I have? Not too much, right? So I guess I can stop here if there are questions. This actually was the last slide, almost one of the last slides. And it is basically saying there are other methods I'm not going to talk about now because I think, so I can just mention them. There are cases in which you cannot quantify all benefits and costs. And in that case, you can adopt, if you have an idea about the direction of the impact, even if you cannot monetize it, you can still include it in the analysis as a complement. And that's what we call qualitative cost-benefit analysis. You monetize everything you can, and you show the results, but then you say there are other effects that are not monetized, and you have to emphasize them, especially if you expect that to be changing potentially the final result. If they're very little, for example, you can just mention it and say that you probably have, with high confidence, these results will remain unchanged. Cost effectiveness analysis is particularly relevant when, for some reason, you do not quantify the benefits. And so you don't monetize the benefits, but you can quantify them. For example, how many lives you can change if you introduce a certain legislation about speed on the road. If you don't want to give a monetary value to life, you can see how much you spend to save one additional life. That is a concept of cost effectiveness, okay? And I think I will stop here because, again, it's more important to have questions if you want clarification. If you're interested, I can even show you 2 screenshots from some that show some results, some things we did. But first, if there are questions, if there is time, I show you the 2 screenshots.
There is a question.
Yes.
Maybe I'll stand up. I'm Nona Baba, and I'm from American University of Armenia, service contractor at the Acopian Center for the Environment. Thank you very much for the presentation. I understand that there might be a lot of nitty-gritties as well that it's not possible to cover within one session. My question, let me start with assumption and then go to the question. When we're talking about a country like Armenia, I can assume that that is heavily reliant on other countries in terms of energy imports. I can assume that when we're running a CBA, cost-benefit analysis, for energy policies, we should consider also the part of energy security. Mm-hmm. Also, given the fact that we're, as I've mentioned, heavily reliant on cheap gas price, but on the other hand, we have a lot of huge potential of domestic energy generation. But throughout the years, it showed that the government doesn't prioritize, let's say, biogas, which can somehow substitute the gas we're currently conducting a biogas pre-feasibility study, and according to the preliminary calculations, some 10% of the imported gas can be compensated by biogas that is generated domestically. And also biogas solves other issues like waste management, emissions, etc. Look at the Denmark. The government is incentivizing this sector. The government is subsidizing this sector. So if biogas can somehow solve energy security, what do you think, given your expertise, when balancing energy security and affordability in Armenia? Does the government run a precise CBA here in Armenia, or we're just flipping a coin?
I have not been working. Okay, this is a very, very difficult to answer question. I have not been working with the Armenian government, so I cannot tell you what happens when there is a meeting. I've been working with the Georgian government, and I've been in meetings. Now, typically, I can tell that most public officials have a very much a financial oriented perspective. So when I was saying there is a difference between financial analysis and cost benefit analysis, most, but not only, actually, not only in Georgia, I have to say also in Italy, right? So most public officials, most people that work in ministries and so on, tend to look at the financial implications. Now, there are energy security has definitely economic consequences, but the financial consequences do not match. And so it's very hard to, at times, to incorporate the value of energy security gain. But not only it could be beneficial, as you said, right? It could be beneficial also in other areas, in other aspects, maybe even for emissions or for other. All of these have a value. It's not easy, so it's not common in the practice in governments across the board, except the ones that are very ahead on this, to incorporate those economic benefits that do not have clear financial quantification in the analysis. Otherwise, they would probably give more incentives. Even determining how big the incentive should be is a challenge, because if you cannot monetize them, then it's hard. You might even give too much of incentives, and that's also wasteful. Okay, so it's tricky. And again, I suspect that they might not be captured fully currently, because that's what happened in most of the world. So, right.
I can, if I
Yes.
can. Samvel Barian, I'm a financial expert and partner in SAMS Consulting. I just want to comment on this question. There is a regulation in Armenia that any interventions in the policies should be assessed by cost-benefit analysis, including the economic analysis. But whether practically it is done or not, I'm not sure. I doubt if it is done, it is implemented. But there is a legislation. If you like, you can try to insist on applying that legislation.
Yes, that's a very good point. Actually, I have to say, also in Georgia, there is, and in Italy. So it's good that there is, because then it gives the opportunity to push for more accurate cost-benefit analysis. And eventually this will be, I think it will be achievable. Having it written is already very important. Yes. I think there was somebody who raised the hand also online, but.
Yeah, I think there is a question online. Could you ask? Because I don't have my microphone on.
Okay, maybe, was it written?
No, there is nothing written. Maybe they want to unmute themselves and say it loudly.
So if somebody online who has a question, please go ahead.
Hi, it's not a question, Norberto, it's Astrina here. I just wanted to chip in. Thank you for the lecture. And indeed, it's taken us to the level which neither Armenian government nor most of the extensive infrastructure projects do. And going back to the question that was voiced about cost-benefit analysis and Samvel Barian's feedback, yes, the legislation requires it, but in many large projects, financial analysis is conducted, but the complexity and the depth of cost-benefit analysis that you presented is certainly not implemented. This is a tradition that episodically is applied by our donor and IFI projects, if World Bank is involved or if EBRD is on board, but that is coming to the barrier of information. For a lot of, if you want to conduct, the evaluation of externalities, monetizing the benefits to the environment or the opportunity costs, you need to have proper monetarization of a lot of ecosystem services, which at this stage is not conducted because we don't have the right legislation in Armenia. So a broader question whether we can quantify, monetize, or come up with any economic value on a lot of the externalities, positive and negative effects, of course, on the environment. We will need to go through a policy reform that allows us on a national level to come up with those monetary values of ecosystem services. In the interim, what is conducted, again, episodically, on large projects like construction of Vorodan Tunnel, construction of a reservoir, large hydropower projects, they conduct quasi-financial, quasi-cost-benefit analysis where broader long-term benefits in terms of economic development, reduced energy dependence are quantified. I see Najde in the auditorium there. For example, for an EIB project, we implement dozens of energy efficiency interventions in public buildings. And with every kilowatt hour that we save, we apply not internal rate of return, but economic rate of return, where we're trying to monetize the reduced dependence on imported fuels as kind of an economic benefit to the broader, saved energy, not only as a cash flow understanding to the project, which is conducted extensively, but also the broader economic benefits as reduced dependence on foreign fuel. Just to give a local context, I wanted to add this comment. Thank you.
Thank you for the context, because again, that I missed. So that's, I think that answers much better than my answer. Yes?
I have a question that sort of follows this. My name is Alex Q. I'm here with Armenia Tree Project, and we are also an environmental organization. And a problem, as the last question just asked also, is, sometimes it's difficult to actually create the tools or build the models to value these externalities or value the value of forest products or these external things that have more impact on the environment. More in a general sense, in your understanding of the models you've built, do you think we at this time have the tools to properly add monetary value to these things, or are we still in the phase of learning how to do this? And then, of course, when you have to have the tools before you're able to implement this policy. In the models you built for Georgia, for example, did you find you were able to accurately sort of pull those monetary values? Like you said, the value of a human life is almost impossible to calculate, but perhaps you could use,
actually, I have good news. Yeah, so there is the literature of cost-benefit analysis have been developed over decades, and we might argue about whether or not these are faithful representations of the real values, but there are all assessment for almost all types of impacts, including the value of statistical value of life. The economists deduct them indirectly. Again, there is the value of environment, the value even of of scenery, the value of biodiversity, the value of a species of animals. I mean, there are studies that work to determine that. There are methodologies to do that. It can be done. They might not be generalizable. Again, a value estimated in the US for a certain species is not the same as the value calculated for another species in Armenia, but the methodology exists. So if for you is very relevant, and if we speak of sometimes you need to do a cost-benefit analysis of the cost-benefit analysis. Like are the gains that you gain from building a very complex model that requires 6 months or 1 year of work of highly paid professionals, requires setting up data collection systems. And is it worth? Does it improve your accuracy enough? But the methodologies are there. And hopefully, with the passing of time, with the technological developments and so on, and with the accumulation of knowledge, it will become cheaper and easier and faster. Therefore, it will be more easily implementable in different countries, right? So there is a good perspective from that point of view. Changing this model, I just say one little thing. So, for example, the model we did was tailored on one specific type of policies. It was, for example, policies to cut carbon emissions and focusing on energy sector. But there was the agricultural center that we had in our think tank that in reality wanted to use the same base of the model and then make a much larger modeling of the agricultural sector, which then would capture all this sort of all effect related to the capacity to absorb carbon through trees, forestry management, and so on. So that could have been embedded into a different version. So you can develop different type of models. Again, a lot of investment, time, resource. It was not done at the end. We pushed it forward. They end didn't have enough time and resources to do it. So, yes.
Norberto, you highlighted that the important part is the aspect of willingness to pay. I'm not sure I understand that because if I don't know, I'm thinking of pollution, for instance. I mean, something, I don't know, like recycling versus landfilling.
Yes.
Right. And landfilling implies whatever kind of contamination of soil, etc., about which people don't care, right? And yeah, mostly. And no one want to pay for better service, for instance. Yes. So how do we deal with that? I mean, how this willingness to pay actually works in this kind of...
Yeah.
How do I decide to include this contamination cost, contamination value, I mean, or losses in the costs or not?
Typically, you do include them, and actually, typically people care. They do not care about what you are mentioning. Like they might not care about, you tell them, oh, the landfill is going to be, well, if it is not built properly, it will lead to water contamination, it will lead to soil contamination, air pollution, and so on. I don't want to pay for it, okay? Or I don't care. That's why typically when you try to capture the willingness to pay, you try to build, for example, there are many ways. One way is to make surveys, all right? But then you try to explain people the consequences of this. People might not care about the concept of water contamination. They might care about whether or not this affects their likelihood to get cancer. Or to, and again, then you go back to the literature that works on that and looks at the correlation between, for example, air quality of air and increased cancer risk, increased reduction in years of life and so on. You have to formulate your surveys in a way in which you, for example, compare two scenarios, right? We did something like that. We didn't do it directly. We use data from the international literature, and then we adapted it to Georgia, right? But for example, we were looking at quality of water. If you ask about people in general, how much you're willing to pay for the quality of water in Georgia, they would not tell you an amount. So what we did, we checked, well, we used international studies, of course, but because we didn't have time to do the survey. But what do these studies that we used do? They were asking people if they would go fish in a river in which they describe the river. Now, they describe it in a way that people understand. In reality, that is associated with a certain level of quality of the water, with certain concentration of pollutants and so on. And then they give an alternative state of the river and another one. And then people say, well, yes, I would go there to do this. I would not go there. How much it costs to go there, how much time you spend to go there. This is an indirect way of measuring how much they like it, how much they value it. I mean, this is one of the methods. There are methods, they're all tricky. They all require time and very careful design if you want to capture that value.
So you're not obliged to make like very like site-specific CPAs.
Well, I can tell you
in that sense.
I can tell you how we solved at the end, we assessed the benefits of the reform of the low water management. How we did, we had these meta-analytic studies that was basically correlating the willingness to pay in many countries in Europe that implemented exactly that type of law. And they were correlating that with the availability of water, the geographical structure, and so on, and even the income of the country. Because, to be honest, in poorer countries, people are willing to pay much less. They do not care in the short term. They say, I have to live day to day. I have to have enough food. I have to have this. Even if it pollutes, I don't care because, okay, pollution might kill me in 10 years. If I starve, I die in a few days. So the willingness to pay is typically smaller. But in all areas, even safety on job, safety on streets, value of statistical life, by the way, when you estimate it, is much lower in poorer countries. So we control for all this, we had a relationship between all these geographical, economic, social characteristics and the willingness to pay. And we estimated the willingness to pay for Georgia, which was the lowest, or way lower than the one that was estimated for even the lowest of the willingness to pay in the European Union. But even with that very low willingness to pay, when we plugged in the effect on the water of the country, the benefits were like 10, 20 times larger than the cost, right? So we could show that. Again, that was a quick solution. Right. Because we had only 3 months to do the study. We couldn't we couldn't do all this field work.
You probably don't need, if you have so many.
If you find a lot of international literature and you manage to, in that case, it was perfect because we could use what was studied in different countries and just substitute the different characteristics that were in Georgia to find a, not perfect, but already approximate estimate of what it could be a reasonable value. We were lucky in that sense because many studies were done. In other areas where they are not done, is much trickier. Okay, but as I said, the more time passes, the more studies are done.
Yeah, it's
the bigger the pool of knowledge, and then there is more hope. Right? It's easier, it's cheaper, and it's more accurate. So again, I'm positive about that. Yes.
Have you used any off-the-shelf software for modeling, or you are using Excel, or how?
What we did.
What is your experience?
So when we have done the most challenging, let's say, that I've been mentioning. So the water one, actually, at that stage, we had not yet developed the computable general equilibrium model, although it would have been better because water enters also everywhere like energy, and so you would want to have a double check at least. But we used Excel actually, build a quite complex model, and then we did some separate analysis. We did some econometric analysis on some sub-component. But even when we built our computable general equilibrium model, we started from an existing software. We used GAMS, right? And then we built all the equations and everything into it. And then we got international databases that are used for this type of analysis. But then we adapted it. We took data from specific Georgia. We checked whether the international data for Georgia were matching what we had from internally. So there was tailoring need to be done. We didn't build, I mean, we used softwares that existed, and then we built models within those. Yes. So we did.
Thank you.
It sped up the work. And despite that, it took many months. So
Would you show the screenshot of your?
yeah, they're very, I mean, I didn't put a lot of stuff because I knew I didn't have time. I just show you one result for the final result that we had when we did the analysis. We were comparing here, we were looking at the climate strategy and action plan 2030 of Georgia. They have set targets for 7 objectives, and they have sector-specific targets in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction. So there was a 15% reduction here in energy generation and transmission. There was a 10% increase in carbon sequestration capacity by the forestry sector. There was a reduction in emission of 5% thanks to development of low carbon approaches. Transport sector should reduce 15%. So every sector had some targets, and they were different. And then we try to say, okay, if we were, because we were testing our model actually in that case. So we said, what if, how could Georgia achieve the final goal, which is reducing the emissions by 35% compared to 1990 levels by 2030? What would be the most efficient? And how efficient is what the government is proposing to do? And so what we compared differentiated taxes, which is basically a case in which we set a tax for CO2 emissions that is different by sector because we want to achieve different reductions. And so basically we simulate what the government is trying to do. So have different impacts on different sectors. Then we say, compare it to standards in which the government says, okay, given the current type of setup of the economy, you have to restrict your CO2 emission in this particular sector to this amount. So every unit of output must have this CO2 emissions, so they must go down so that we satisfy our limit. And then we say, okay, instead, let's adopt a uniform tax. So we just give a price to CO2 for the whole country, and then we see what happens. And then when we compare the 3 cases, we could show that if you apply standards, you tell them what they have to do. It's a law. We have a loss of welfare of 0.53% in a year, right? In the equilibrium at the end, in the last year. You lose 22% if actually you have to add them up. So this is 45%, 0.45. Instead, you have here 0.4 loss, and here you have 0.37. It's not a big difference when you apply taxes instead of standard. The government was going more towards standards. They were not introducing a tax. This is you have a differentiated tax, and here is just you give just the price to CO2, and then let the companies adjust. And basically, why? Because for some sectors, it is easy to reduce CO2 emissions. And so those for which it's cheaper than paying the tax will reduce much more than you tell them because they want to save. They don't want to pay the tax on carbon. For the ones for which it is very expensive to reduce emissions, well, they will rather pay the tax. But overall, you set the tax to achieve the goal you want, so you achieve it. But in this way, you minimize the costs for the economy. And we proved with our simulation that actually the approach of setting standards was definitely much worse than the others. And again, this is only an impact in 1 year, but think to the cumulative effect over 20, 30 years, because energy policies have impact over 20, 30 years. So it is a big difference in terms of well-being.
So in all cases, the target is achieved, right?
In all cases, the target was achieved.
Yeah.
And but the biggest loss, of course, the difference between the two is very little. This is already bigger. And then if you cumulate it over the 50 years, of course, or 30 years or 20 years is much bigger.
Just one question for Georgia. What is the economic cost of capital you used for discounting? And it is the same for all cases?
Okay. This we did some years ago. I do not remember.
Okay.
I do not remember that. Let me
They
show you.
should be the same. I think so. At
Sorry?
least they should be the same. It should be the same
No, in
for three
yeah, in
scenarios.
all of this,
Yes.
at the beginning, it's identical.
Mhm.
But it might change as the economy changes, because then the composition, capital, investments in the different sector changes. So again, the accumulation of capital also differs, and the employment changes. So this is I just wanted to show, this was our welfare effect. We show, and we have a lot of tables in which we show the impacts in terms of capital, import, export. But again, this was more to give you an idea what.
It was interesting for Georgia, how much is it?
Yes, but yeah, now I don't remember, because again, well, I can show you the last one. Sorry, because it takes time, but yeah, where is it? How do I close it now? Let me go here. This is a very different way in which we did it. This is a standard cost benefit analysis more.
Can you zoom it in?
Yes,
Or slideshow.
I try slideshow. Let's see. Why don't I see?
At the top in the orange bar.
Wait, let me make it bigger. Ah, then now I see it. Hello? Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, it's just a section, it's not all, right? It was many years. So here we had a summary. This is where capital expenditure actually there was an idea of introducing, stimulating the adoption of electric vehicles. This is very condensed information here for only a few years. And this total does not at all match because it was a bigger. But why, did we use actually that same model? Actually, it was the hybrid model we used. Here we did the analysis of cash flows, okay? For like the cost for the government to subsidize, to give incentives, to build the infrastructure and so on. This is captured in the capital expenditure, actually, they're here. And then we had the operating income. So actually the revenues are the savings related in terms of fuel and others. Overall, it was all the financial benefits of having introduced that. And then there are, of course, the change in operational expenditure, okay? Which were lower. The operational expenditure of electric vehicles tend to be lower, actually, up to a certain, until you have to change the battery. So, but what is interesting is that this we used because we were requested to do a more financial analysis and then to give an idea of how it would change if we were taking into account externalities. So we used the model to see how the change in demand for fuel would then affect, for example, emissions. And then we gave a value to emissions because Georgia was thinking to sell the savings as certificates. And so we had a value for the certificate for every ton of CO2 saved. And we also basically calculated the environmental benefits using that value. And so we estimated the change at the country level after introducing this in the energy sector. And we were able to add this part, for example, to the analysis. And actually, this improved significantly the IRR, which it was much lower. It was actually, in certain specification, it was not even profitable financially. But when you were including other effects like this, environmental benefits plus, well, the certificates they were selling. So we had them already there. But here we also gave a value to the externalities. And it did indeed make it, so show how the economic value was substantially higher. But just to give an idea, even in a regular cost benefit analysis, you can get additional information by models like this, even if you want to conduct it here, because this was not a big policy. We had a certain number of cars, right? So it was my project, more like a project type. But we still used the fuel and try to include it into the larger model to have an idea of what happened. We did also a different study, which is more similar to the one I showed before, in which we actually put all the interventions which were expected. There were 12 type of intervention, and we got also the welfare effects. right? And then we were able also in that case to show, actually in that case, the interesting thing, and I conclude, I think, with this, the interesting thing we found is that when we took all these 12 policies that were towards green transition, we were expecting a negative effect from the GDP point of view, from other aspects. And maybe we were hoping that there was at least an improvement from the economic point of view, which again, we didn't know at the beginning. Turned out that even from the economic point of view, even financially, at a certain point, it was becoming beneficial. So that was a very, in a way, more optimistic than we were thinking. But again, it all depends on the assumption you make, on the way the model works. But it gave us something that we did not expect, right? We were expecting that when we were taking into account the whole economic picture, it would have been beneficial, but not that in reality, the economy would not have lost. It actually, for example, in some imports, in some export, even improved. And so there were sectors that really benefited from it. That's it. Unless there are more questions.
Thank you very much.
All right. Good. So, I forgot to show you one thing, but basically, there is, I don't know if you will be sharing if you are interested, you can ask for the presentation.
Sure.
And at the end, there is, I wanted to show that. Yes, sorry. And I forgot because now I'm a bit tired. Where is it? On the desktop. Go ahead, please. So there will be another seminar, but it will be on a very different, well, it's related, but a very different topic. It's not cost-benefit analysis anymore. It's more a general discussion about challenges in energy markets for the 21st century, which are related to energy transition. And yeah, this is the next one. It's behind this.
In April?
Yeah, 15th of April. There will be this new third seminar on energy market issues for the 21st century, because again, a lot of the green transition centers on energy markets, right? And I think this is another important aspect to look at. Okay.
You are in a mailing list of STREACS project, or you are following the social media of STREACS project. We are going to share it today or tomorrow.
Yeah, the recording and the slides, if you know, but it will be in the recording and also the registration link for the application. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Well, I hope I didn't run too
I
much.
just want to introduce myself if you want to come, and then I think we should maybe take a picture. Be cheesy, take a picture. They're gonna ask for it, so I don't want to do it either.